Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here for you each week. Come hell or high water, legislative changes, electoral victories and losses, all put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org. We've got a great program lined up this week with lots of hands in your pocket. And unfortunately, it seems like that's where they all go first, is your pocket, because you can afford to support all the big government programs that are going on. Our first guest is from the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. I believe the Southern Poverty Law Center calls them a hate group. I'm not sure. Pretty much everyone else is on their list. He is Skip Estes, legislative analyst from the Center for State Fiscal Reform at ALEC. Skip, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week?
Hi, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Excellent. Thank you for taking a little time out with us. You have a new column out at alec.org titled, "There's No Better Time for Tax Reform in Virginia Than the Present." I remember having this very conversation with this fellow named Bob McDonnell when he was governor. People may have forgotten that he was governor for a while because the tax collections were booming. The economy was growing. We were number one in business. I said, now is the time to cut taxes. And he said, oh, I can't do that. So now I know that tax reform plans have been floated out there. Senator Mark Peake has one that he's hoping to bring up in the next General Assembly session that would cancel out any internet sales tax with a drop in our brick and mortar sales tax. Is this, kind of the environment we're in, where we're going to these kind of bigger, more generic taxes, and we can start reforming our taxes here in the Commonwealth, Skip?
Well, I would say that's right, and that's also a good thing, I might add. At ALEC, we have what we call our principles of taxation that are grounded in very well thought out, well-researched economic literature that the best taxes are the ones that are fair, simple, and low. And by coming with a tax reform like Senator Peake's suggestion, you're going to get a tax code that is less nitpicky, less onerous to specific people, and is more broad, more fair, and more easily understood.
What about the argument about the internet sales tax that, given the fact that we're leaving this national sales tax to the states to set up what they want, that the argument that a California, for example, could then go after and target businesses that had left California because of their high tax rates with higher tax rates to make up for the social programs they need because the businesses left in the usual wash, rinse, and repeat cycle. Should there not, if we're going to have an internet sales tax, a sales tax that's ostensibly a national sales tax, shouldn't it be set by the federal government to say, here's what the sales tax is on the internet?
Well, fortunately, they still have that opportunity. It's unfortunate to see the Supreme Court get rid of their physical presence standard in terms of internet taxation. We at ALEC did quite a bit of work trying to fight against that and making the argument that, yes, you're going to have states that have more extractive tax codes like California or New York, going after states with more generous tax codes like New Hampshire or Delaware, which currently doesn't have a sales tax. You're going to see those large high-tax states see those businesses that are residing in those lower tax states as a cash cow opportunity. And during the discussion around making, getting rid of that physical standard, you had legislators that were concerned about mom and pop businesses on Main Street, which was a fair concern. But one thing that was missed is that those mom and pop businesses use websites like eBay or Etsy or Amazon to sell their products. So while they thought by getting rid of this physical standard they were actually giving more power to their own constituents, they actually ended up punting to those high tax states.
What would it, and again, I know we're kind of circling the wagons in this, and I want to get into some of the specifics in tax reform here in the Commonwealth in a moment. But if I always remember, and I lived for a while in Delaware, and I lived for a while just on the other side of both the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts borders from Delaware, and I noticed that there were awful lot of furniture stores and things like that, big ticket items that had outlets just on the Delaware side. And it was pointed out to me by nonetheless, liberal scion Rick Santorum once that a Pennsylvanian is responsible for paying Pennsylvania's sales tax on a purchase they make, even if they make it in Delaware. If they buy a car in Delaware because there's no sales tax, or buy furniture, they're required to pay those sales tax figures in their state of residence. Isn't that always been sort of my bugaboo with the internet sales tax? It's really the citizens that are supposed to be paying the sales tax, and we're laying it on a business.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate comparison that you made between the stores in Delaware right over the Pennsylvania border, and it remains to be seen whether or not states are going to take that action. Mm-hmm. It's really going to be an interesting issue to watch this upcoming legislative season. One thing that we still are holding out hope for is that Congress and I guess now it'd be in Chairman Goodlatte's committee, we're hoping that they'll be able to come up with either reinforce a physical standard through congressional legislation or some other fix that will actually protect states and protect consumers from out-of-state taxation.
Well, I know it was almost 10 years ago when Bob McDonnell offered up a reworking of the Virginia transportation funding by going after an internet sales tax. And I spoke to Chairman Goodlatte at the time, and he said, we don't have any internet sales tax in the Judiciary Committee that I'm aware of. They should have probably called and asked me before they did that. So yet again, here we go. Communications is key. So talk about what is being discussed for this year's General Assembly. Skip Estes is legislative analyst for the American Legislative Exchange Council and their Center for State and Fiscal Reform. No better time for tax reform in Virginia than the present. I guess one could say your column is applicable anytime, but what is Senator Peake's plan? Explain that to our listeners. Are there other ones out there as well?
Well, I actually can't speak on Senator Peake's plan right now. The nature of our organizations, we cover tax developments in every state. So we're gearing up for this upcoming January. We're excited to see what other suggestions people put out in the mix. But what I can speak to is what states have already done right now in terms of tax reform.
Right.
And it's important to point out that this discussion on state-level tax reform is a direct outgrowth of the federal reform that we saw last December. At least in terms of its news coverage, people kind of stopped right there, but what they didn't understand is that there's a whole lot more discussion going on at the states about how they're going to treat federal tax reform. So just to clarify, one thing that states have to do when discussing their tax code is whether or not they're going to conform to any federal changes. What that pretty much means is that if the definition of a taxable item changes or an exemption is removed or a deduction increased, those changes at the federal level, states have the option to conform to those new definitions. And what we're seeing out of the federal tax reform is a broader tax base, meaning more things are taxable. And as a result, certain tax liabilities increase. If states conform to those federal changes without any sort of rate change on their own end, those citizens are going to see a tax increase. Well, so some of the changes that we've seen about states making is raising their income tax threshold. So, for instance, if your tax threshold is $20,000 for the top rate, increasing that threshold to $30,000 on the top rate, making more money fall into a lower tax bracket. Other states have doubled the standard deduction, and that's what we're seeing some discussion in Virginia surrounding. I believe it was South Carolina most recently doubled that standard deduction from $6,000 to $12,000.
Okay.
Or in fact, I think they joined the federal policy of $24,000 for joint filers, and that's going to be a massive tax cut for South Carolinians. Some states are also lowering their corporate income tax rate, kind of in the same spirit as federal policy. And as a result, they're going to make their states more competitive for business, and it'll bring opportunities to that state.
Well, now, and we've talked about, actually, this was the subject of last week's program as well, was that, there are quite a few tax increases coming for us if we don't act on these things with the next General Assembly session, Skip. And I can hear my friend David Toscano, the program flags from a station in Charlottesville. We know David well. We disagree with him on a lot of things, but I can hear David saying, well, if we're losing out on federal money, how are we going to replace that if we don't, fill in those gaps with, state taxation? And I'm sure if he is lucky enough next November to win a majority in the Virginia General Assembly, you might see that. But it could be a push even in a 51-49 General Assembly.
Well, I don't think that we're losing out on federal dollars. In fact, really pretty much any sort of federal tax change is not going to result in, we can even see in Congress, they really made no spending changes. So really, Virginia's going to be getting the exact same amount of money that they could have forecasted coming from the federal government. On that note, Virginia is actually going to be seeing quite a big, they call it a windfall in, policy circles, but people concerned about, lower government spending, more responsible government spending, they call that a tax increase pretty much.
Yeah.
You're going to be taking money out of Virginians' pockets from one year to the next, and you're going to see government revenues grow. What else is that other than tax increase? And we're looking at an average yearly revenue or a tax increase of around $700 million if the General Assembly doesn't take any sort of action on lowering tax burdens for Virginians.
Wow.
Breaking it down a little bit further, next year they're projecting to get an additional $555 million in revenue, and that's projected to grow to over $1 billion a year by 2024.
Now, is that based on the federal tax code changes and then that leads to, or is that a prosperity index where Virginians are just more prosperous, therefore making more revenue?
So that's coming directly from Secretary Lane's financial report to the money committees, put together, I believe, by Chambridge Analytics. That money is partially going to be coming from economic growth, but the vast majority of it is coming from assuming full conformity to federal tax changes.
What is the... I guess, there's... I saw the numbers. I think it's down to 64 legislative chambers are in the control of Republicans at very least. One would presume that by percentages, most of them are quasi-conservative minded, across the nation. And so this could be an enormous reinvigoration of the economic churn that the original federal tax cuts brought about if all of these general assemblies and legislatures, followed suit like South Carolina's and continued to, up the ante on those tax cuts to the citizens. We could see even more money back into the economy, couldn't we?
Well, and what's remarkable, I'm glad you brought up the partisan point, is that a lot of these tax changes and these tax cuts that are coming out of tax conformity are being made in states with Democratic legislatures.
Really?
Maryland ended up cutting, by keeping the personal exemption and increasing the standard deduction, are saving taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars starting next year.
Interesting how all of a sudden, Democrats get tax cut gospel when re-elections start to have to come around. Tax cuts become good when you're off the campaign trail.
Well, and I think it's not so much of a story of, Democrat or Republican. It's a story of having strong legislative leadership and principled tax policy. States like, for instance, even with Rhode Island, by keeping their personal exemption and growing it, they've offered millions of dollars in tax cuts to their citizens. Washington State, by cutting property taxes, has saved their taxpayers almost $400 million by 2021. So it's not a story of D versus R. It's a story of having strong, principled leadership.
Let me ask you this then, Skip. Are we in Virginia in an odd place because we have so many government employees? And so our industry is in some cases government and not so much an automobile or an aircraft manufacturing industry. What about business taxes and reforms there that the General Assembly could be taking up to, again, invigorate other things besides Virginia's, cash industry, which is government? Well,
I've been talking to people at the Department of Taxation and other stakeholder groups across the state. And one theme that you always see come up when we're remarking about the Virginia economy is that it needs to be more diverse. Mm-hmm. And you hit the nail right on the head when you said that Virginia, a large part of our economy is government. Well, by cutting things like the corporate tax rate, we're looking at making Virginia a much more competitive state for business. Right now in Tennessee, West Virginia, and Maryland are the only states where they're only neighboring states with higher corporate tax rates. North Carolina is half of ours.
Wow.
And also explains why a lot of corporations and especially banks are moving to North Carolina and growing their economy. I'll even point out as a great example, Bristol, Virginia versus Bristol, Tennessee. That city's right on the state line.
Yeah.
There's no reason why businesses located in Bristol, Tennessee couldn't be located in Bristol, Virginia. But it's because of tax code differences that those businesses have opted to put themselves up in Bristol, Tennessee, versus Bristol, Virginia. And as a result, our side of the city has actually been struggling quite difficultly, despite a strong federal economy or national economy.
Well, let me follow through on that. And from a federalist level, if we have more businesses starting up, more startups, even the ones that might contract to the government, that lowers government costs and actually creates a better environment for government savings, federal government savings. If we have a better business environment in Virginia, where businesses can either diversify away from just being a government contractor and/or start up a secondary government contracting business to compete against some of the others, and maybe actually drive the cost down a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up. And if you go up to Northern Virginia and you look at the skyline of D.C. versus the skyline of Arlington, you'll find Grant Thornton, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, their offices are in Rosslyn, Virginia. Mm-hmm. Accenture's offices are in Arlington, Virginia, and those companies their headquarters aren't, or their D.C. offices aren't headquartered in Maryland. They might have a couple, but they're not owning towers across the other state's border. Sure. Because Virginia has a more competitive tax policy, at least relative to Maryland, and that really highlights how important, especially around borders, tax policy ends up being.
So what tweaks, Skip, would you suggest the Virginia General Assembly look at come January as they gather to comply? Some of the things that you've seen other states do, a top 5 list, if you would.
Yeah, so a lot of other states have been taking this as an opportunity to make their tax codes more competitive. They could join the federal policy of doubling the standard deduction. Like we mentioned, South Carolina did that and increased their standard deduction from $12,000 for families filing to $24,000. That's an incredible amount of money that they're putting back into their citizens' pockets. You have North Carolina, which, continuing a long trend of tax reform, lowered the individual income tax rate and corporate income tax rates as part of their conformity legislation. And they also increased their standard deduction to $20,000 for couples filing jointly. You have states like Michigan, which restores and also increases the personal exemption and also ties that exemption to inflation as a part of their conformity legislation. And it's expected to save Michiganders $405 million by 2021.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's just incredible stuff is happening at the state level right now. It's been a very interesting year for state-level tax reform.
And if anyone...
I don't know if you saw, but former Governor Rick Scott, in Florida, he announced that he had saved during his tenure of his administration over $1 billion in taxes for their citizens. Mm-hmm. So it can be done. You have even states that don't have large budgets, like Alabama, cutting $4 million from their conformity legislation.
Wow.
So the options are abounding, and the states are a great blueprint for what Virginia could do on their own.
Well, here's to January, Skip, and we're going to share your article online at our social media platform as well, ALEC.org. I know many of the members of the General Assembly are regular visitors to what you do at ALEC as well. Skip, I appreciate your time. There's no better time for tax reform in Virginia than the present. One could say that any time, but I think right now with the federal tax code changes, as we ran down last week on this program, it is imperative that we are aware of it. Otherwise, remind everyone again the size of Virginia's tax. You said $700 million extra revenue if they don't conform and don't do anything?
Yeah, so if Virginia conforms entirely to federal tax changes, they're looking at an average of around $700 million in increased revenue, and that plays out as a tax increase in Virginians' pockets.
Yeah,
and that's projected to grow to over $1 billion a year by 2024.
Gee. Well, let's do something about it. Let's do it now. Skip, thank you so much for taking some time out with us this weekend here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And again, it's ALEC.org. And coming up next, David Hyman from the Georgetown University Law School, Overcharged. He's got a brand new book, Overcharged, Why Americans Pay Too Much for Health Care. And many of us are going through that donut hole right now, that open enrollment period where you're discovering that just keeping the same insurance is a pricey proposition. Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Joining us now to talk about their new book, Overcharged, Why Americans Pay Too Much for Health Care. And I think a lot of folks are stinging. This is about that time when everyone has that sit down with their human resources department. Hey, we've got a new health care plan for you. Take us into it. David Hyman and Charles Silver, the authors of the book. Dr. Hyman, welcome back to the program. This is your second visit, I believe. How are you doing, sir?
Doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Charles, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week, sir?
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you for doing this book because, I know your publicity director leads in with the EpiPen story, but certainly, and that may be one of the most egregious cases of it, but with a second health insurance provider back in Virginia now, we've watched the rates conversantly go up $50, almost 50% over where they were last year for many people around the Commonwealth of Virginia. So it's not just the medicine itself, but it's the insurance that then pays for that. Is this all fruits, Charles, of a subsidization and what we should expect from these kind of things?
Well, it's a combination of factors. One is we rely so heavily on insurance to pay for things that it skews all the prices. Normally, when people buy things directly and pay for them themselves, there's a natural ceiling on the amount that they'll pay. Mm-hmm. They won't pay more than they think something is worth. But when we rely on insurance, the incentives are completely changed. The marginal cost to the consumer is very small. It's just their copay. And so they want whatever the treatment is, regardless of the price. And, of course, today, Americans believe newer is always better, so they all want the latest thing, regardless of the cost. And nobody can say no. It's really a situation where anybody who mentions rationing health care on the basis of cost is immediately ostracized. It's the third rail of politics, so no politician wants to talk about it.
Sure.
And so we wind up in this ever-spiraling cycle where we just pay more and more and more for drugs.
Well, and you're, Dr. Hyman, you're a professor of law at Georgetown. I mean, this is why the government isn't designed to be in all these industries, never mind healthcare, because there's no incentive for a politician to want to make these decisions. Is one of the reasons I find it disingenuous. They talk about single-payer healthcare systems. I watched protest marches outside police headquarters because the wrong kid got arrested. Can you imagine what happens if somebody's grandma doesn't get a stent because she's 67 and the bureaucracy says no? I just think this is constructual.
So the government certainly doesn't want to be visibly seen as saying no, and healthcare providers, aggressively lobby the government to get them to cover anything and everything. And so you have, politics corrupts medicine and medicine corrupts politics.
So the free market, and I love listening to folks, Charles, talking about how the free market has wrecked the healthcare system. How long has it been since there's actually been a free market? Because you mentioned insurance. I think it's almost more accurate to call it assurance than insurance for the healthcare industry. How long has it been since we've really known what medicine costs?
Oh, boy, a very long time. And when I say insurance, I don't necessarily mean private insurance. I would include Medicare and Medicaid. Mm-hmm. It's really more about third-party payment arrangements than it is about true insurance. In fact, a lot of what we think of as insurance really isn't insurance at all. In most areas, insurance is reserved for catastrophic events. Your insurance doesn't pay to repaint your house. It pays to rebuild your house if your house burns down or something like that.
Absolutely.
So true insurance is reserved for catastrophes. What we have is a combination of insurance plus comprehensive payment plans for all kinds of things that are not catastrophes. And those things skew the market just extraordinarily. I mean, when people are relying on insurance to pay for doctor's office visits that cost, $75, the incentive to shop for efficient providers of medical services is gone, and prices just keep spiraling, even as far back as 1965, when Medicare and Medicaid came online. Researchers who were following the cost of health care found that the cost immediately started to increase. As soon as Medicare was created, hospitals realized that, hey, the government's going to pay us on a cost-plus basis, so we can start raising our, quote, costs and get more money.
Mm-hmm.
And doctors figured out as well that they could raise prices with impunity. And almost immediately, starting in the mid-1960s, we saw healthcare start to increase at roughly double the rate of general inflation. And so I would say that's about the last time that we saw what is truly a free market in healthcare. That said, there are some sectors now where the private market is reasserting itself. You know, a lot of people are now finding themselves priced out of the insurance market, mm-hmm. or with very, very high deductibles, and they are increasingly turning to retail healthcare providers that they have to pay out of pocket. And so we are now seeing a lot of activity in the retail sector. I just saw, for example, a report that CVS, which recently bought or acquired Aetna, is moving in a big way into the sort of minute clinic area.
I was going to ask if that's what you meant when the retail medicine, these walk-in care centers that you see coming up. That's what you're talking about then?
Yeah, urgent care, but mm-hmm. also, you know, the typical things that people go to doctors for. So, you know, blood pressure monitoring, diabetes monitoring, routine kinds of tests for various things, medication for coughs and colds. They don't have to go to doctors for these things. They can go to minute clinics or other similar services and be just fine.
Well, let me follow up, and I know, Charles, we only have you for a limited bit, so I want to, and David, we'll circle back, and if you have a thought on this, please insert it there. It seems to have, the next step is the development of the health maintenance. Is it health maintenance organization or health management organization? I always forget what HMO stands for, where it's always been my feeling that we look at the standards of Standard Oil when we talk about monopolies, but here we have an industry that not only controls the provider but the consumer. You have to join the club in order to access the doctors. The doctors have to charge what the HMO says and act in a way and see as many patients as their contract belies. I've never seen an industry control both sides of a market like this, Charles. Is this the next phase in why things have gotten so expensive?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, we have a system that regulates the market comprehensively. So we have, you know, Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor, and throughout our lives, we're all required to pay taxes for mm-hmm. these programs. So if we become, you know, Medicaid eligible, we want to use the services. When we become Medicare eligible, we obviously want to take advantage of that. Then we have tax subsidies for employer-provided insurance. That's actually the single largest tax exemption that exists. So everybody's trying to get an insurance through their employers. And then we have Obamacare for people who kind of fall between the cracks, too rich for Medicaid but too poor, don't have employer-sponsored insurance. So, you know, they get subsidies. It's really quite comprehensive, the government intrusion into the healthcare market. And you're absolutely right when people sort of casually say, well, the market has failed to provide cost-effective healthcare. It really has not had a chance. The system is designed to frustrate the ordinary operation of the market.
Charles Silver, Dave Hyman, authors of Overcharged, Why Americans Pay Too Much for Health Care. Charles, I know we have to let you go, so I thank you. Thanks for writing the book. Again, I think it's a stocking stuffer for everyone's Christmas gift-giving lists. You know, I know it doesn't sound like a page-turner like the next John Grisham novel, but I think more important to us than what that's about. Charles, thank you very much, and have a wonderful holiday few weeks as well, Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of that. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
And David, you hang on the line, and we'll come right back to you after this on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, visiting with David Hyman, one of the authors of Overcharged, Why Americans Pay Too Much for Healthcare. David, you at the law school, Georgetown Law, I look at how the legal side of the healthcare industry has sort of been weaponized to hurt us into these places. Certainly, I think the most egregious is where the Supreme Court says, you know what, the Commerce Clause can regulate whether you buy something, even if you don't buy it, and that sort of thing. How do we untangle the legal web of the way the healthcare industry has been pulled away from our decision making and sort of inserted into a one size fits all?
So let me just note that this Supreme Court actually was divided on the question of whether the Commerce Clause would authorize the individual mandate, and Congress relatively recently got rid of the financial sanctions that were associated with the mandate. So that's less of a driver than it might be. The more important drivers are the sizable subsidies for people to consume health care. So Charlie Silver mentioned earlier, the tax exclusion for getting health coverage through your place of employment is the single most expensive tax subsidy we have.
Wow.
So that's, lots and lots of money that we're spending to encourage people to consume health care services through their place of employment. So that's an important factor. The spending on Medicare and Medicaid, heavily subsidized, is another encouragement. And then there's very comprehensive regulation, right? We regulate who can provide health care services, where and how they can provide them. And that can chill entry by new competitors who bring different business models and can lower the price. So those are, all factors that you need to be taking on. You need to address the subsidies. It shouldn't be cheaper for people to consume health care than anything else. It ought to be on an even playing field. And you need to make sure your regulations are, genuinely protecting consumers rather than protecting incumbent providers.
Well, and certainly it seems like it's almost trying to create the scenario for us to say, oh, this is logical. So, of course, we drive up the costs. So you see what a checkup costs at your local primary care physician, bust out retail, what they charge your health insurance provider. And you're like, well, I better have insurance. I can't afford this, when really that's not what it should cost if the doctor was just competing with other doctors for your business. Because, on the other side, then they don't want to lose their affiliation with the HMO. So they're going to go along with this, and they won't have sort of that bottom desk drawer rate. Oh, you only want to pay cash? Okay, here it's $25. I've had doctors do that for me in the past. Upwards of $200, where things are a little bit more involved. But they, it was strictly, they had to know me for a very long time before they trusted me to go through that, because they didn't want me calling the HMO and selling them out saying, oh, this guy broke the rules and that kind of thing. So I almost think it's like a self-fulfilling scenario, David.
Yeah, the book talks about this dynamic. It's very peculiar, right? Normally we think that insurance should be reserved for low probability but catastrophic outcome kinds of cases. So, your house burns down, you're struck by lightning level of frequency types of problems. And it's really bad when it happens, but thankfully it doesn't happen that often. Whereas in healthcare, we've gotten used to using insurance for everything, and high prices encourage people to buy insurance because they're understandably scared. But there's a pretty robust, market now in people who are paying out of pocket for things, and that's creating a lot of demand for people to offer, concierge care and sort of advertising for MRI and CT scans at lower prices if you don't involve your insurance. And those are, signs that the prices are just completely unmoored from reality. It doesn't work like other markets, right? The prices bear no relationship to what healthcare providers actually collect. They're just sticker prices.
Well, let me ask you this, because Virginia is a puzzlement to me. At one point, through Delegate Landis and several other members of the General Assembly, we've passed, and even Terry McAuliffe, of all people, signed into law a law that permits for direct primary care associations to exist in the Commonwealth. And then in the next breath, it seems like we're expanding Medicaid, and the hospital associations are out sponsoring radio and TV ads telling people to support the idea of expanding Medicaid and thanking previously conservative members of the Senate for leading this. So I'm getting such mixed signals from the Commonwealth of Virginia, David. Is this just sort of the dog and pony show they want us to see?
Well, it's not surprising that healthcare providers and especially hospitals are enthusiastic about the Medicaid expansion, because the result of it is they get paid for treating Medicaid beneficiaries that until previously were uninsured, and then they had to, either give it to them as charity care or chase them down and try and collect whatever they could off of their, heavily inflated charge master of prices, the sort of sticker prices that I was talking about. So if you're a healthcare provider and your choice is to give it away or to have the government pay you, guess which one you pick, right? It's perfectly rational for healthcare providers like hospitals to lobby in favor of Medicaid expansion, because it increases the number of people who are paying for their services. And, it's suddenly not so awkward to have these difficult conversations with patients. Can you pay for this? Or
Right.
are you, a charity case?
Yeah.
So that's why healthcare providers like it. But it's not at all so straightforward that the rest of us should think it's a good thing. If you look at the evidence on the impact of Medicaid, it's pretty clear that it, reduces people's financial stress, and that it improves their sort of mental well-being. But the evidence on its actually, health effects is much more modest and much more mixed.
Well, it also has the reverse economic incentive, and we've seen this with subsidized Section 8 housing as well, that a little bit of an increase in your income, all of a sudden you lose all of your health care because you're now out of the Medicaid trigger, and now you've got to go find your own. So a $5 raise equals, a $200 loss in your income.
Yeah, these cliff effects, as they're called, are a huge issue in designing policy in this area, because people can have, effective marginal tax rates that are just off the charts. As you say, make a little bit extra and suddenly you lose a huge amount of benefits. And so you need to design things so it's smoother, the phase out of the benefits. Now, you can't have a situation where everybody's on the receiving end. That doesn't work very well either.
No, I don't think it would. And as a design, I mean, you look at the Veterans Administration and the issues they have with health care, even Vet's Choice. I have several instances of listeners who have told me that they went and used the Vet's Choice program, and the hospital still hasn't been paid by the VA. So now they're coming after them, as you said, trying to chase them down for the health care costs until the VA, finally gets on the ball. And that hits credit scores and other things as well, David. So, I mean, it's a ripple effect through the economy.
Yeah, these high, list prices, A, encourage people to get insurance, but B, create huge burdens on people who get bills from out-of-network providers, or if they're uninsured, right? So it affects both people. One of the things I do when I talk about this is I ask the audience, raise your hand if you've received a surprise medical bill or someone you know has received one. And typically 75 to 80% of people raise their hand. And then I say, how many of you got a surprise bill the last time you took your car to an auto body shop, right? Did the painter send you a separate bill for painting the hood, or the guy who, took the dents out of the bumper?
Oh,
everybody laughs because, of course, if you were a body shop and you allowed the painter to send a separate bill, you get terrible Yelp reviews and you'd be out of business.
Sure.
But in healthcare, we just sort of expect it, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's surprised that hospitals haven't solved this problem, although auto body shop people seem capable of doing it.
I went to the University of Virginia hospital for chemotherapy several years ago, and by the end of the day, we were receiving bills that seemed to be in such a redundant state, and then turned out several of them were redundant. And we actually went to their billing office, which nonplussed several of the staffers who didn't expect to see a human being walking into the door. And I said, give me one number. I want to write you a check, get rid of you, and not have to get another one of these saying, oh, you owe this doctor's association or this segment of the hospital money. And they did for me. But, I mean, I don't know if everyone thinks to just go to the billing office and say, I want one number, and then we're done with each other.
They're not set up to do that. Certainly not before you receive the treatment, and often not after, right? They'll say, well, let's wait and see how much your insurance is going to pay, and then we can decide how much we want to charge you. And, the bills will come from a bunch of different sources. That's why people talk about surprise medical bills, right? You get one bill from the hospital, you get a separate bill from the anesthesiologist and from the radiologist,
and sometimes the doctor himself, the doctor's group, you think the doctor worked for the hospital, but apparently there's another company within the hospital that the doctor works for. So let me ask you this. So my wife and I, it's $800 a month for Blue Cross Blue Shield healthcare insurance. Why is the health savings account not the going thing? I know why insurance companies don't want it to be. What are the legal ramifications of fixing the health savings account industry so that a 20-year-old can treat it like a 401k, stick his $400 a month in there every month, and by the time they're 65, they don't need Medicaid. They don't need Social Security because they've been saving it their whole lives?
So, one of the issues historically has been that the Republicans are pretty keen on health savings accounts, and the Democrats don't like them at all. And they've, that sort of partisan battle has shaped the availability of health savings accounts over time. Two is, not everybody thinks ahead and plans ahead, and the challenge is, how do you get people to think about their future in terms of saving for their future health needs and their retirement and all of the other things? And that's, has proven to be more difficult than, one might hope. So I think the combination of those two things has historic, and I guess the third factor is lots of people seem to prefer a system where they don't have to worry about using their own money to pay for health care.
I guess we've created that scenario ourselves, haven't we?
Well, we led people to believe that there was some pot of money somewhere that was going to pay for all of this, and healthcare providers loved it, and lots of patients liked it too, as long as the costs were reasonably affordable. But over time, it became less and less affordable.
Well, Dr. Hyman, I appreciate the book is a new book out, and it's called Overcharged, and it demystifies a lot of why you would think that it should be much less expensive for this kind of coverage. I appreciate the book just in time for Christmas gift giving, and I mean that. It's got a 5-star rating on Amazon.com. Great new Virginia company. We welcome them to their new East Coast headquarters here in Virginia. But I appreciate it. Is there a good website for them to go directly to visit some of your work, Dr. Silver, or Dr. Ryan? Pardon me, Hyman, or do you guys keep a Facebook page on the books as well?
So the best place to learn more about the book is to go to the website for the book, which is overchargedforhealthcare.com.
Okay.
And you'll find some videos there and a chapter or two that you can download for free. There's a link, I think, to the Amazon website. If you want to learn more about other work that we've done, I have a website at Georgetown University Law Center. Professor Silver has a website at the University of Texas. And you can download a lot of our research at a website called ssrn.com, Social Sciences Research Network. And just search for our names.
Well, great.
Easy to find.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hyman. I appreciate it. And again, thank Dr. Silver for his visit as well. We appreciate it. It's Overcharged, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Great to talk to you. Bye now.
Have a great holiday, and you as well, since next time we speak, it will be post-Black Friday, the weekend after Thanksgiving, here at Freedom and Prosperity Radio. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, yes, you may not believe it, but there's an awful lot to be thankful for in this great nation, even as much as we seem hell-bent on making it not so great. It is a great place, and it is one of the most unique places in the world. Be thankful for it, and until next week, so long! And thanks for all the fish.